Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Seibert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
All right, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we're going to be talking about infidelity.
Ooh. We see this probably more than people might think, simply because infidelity can have such a wide definition.
Yeah. I mean, it's when we typically think about it, it's they had sex with somebody else, right? Another partner. What are some other ways we can?
That I've seen could be emotional. So they were texting an ex-girlfriend. They had phone sex. It could be having like a flirty relationship with a coworker or an employee. It can look all kinds of different ways for different couples, right? If my boundary is I don't want porn in my relationship, and then my partner views porn.
Yeah.
Or I don't want my partner to masturbate, and then they do. That can be seen as an infidelity.
And this kind of touches on something we've talked about in the previous episode around boundaries, right? They look different for everybody. And that's why infidelity can look different and feel different for different couples, right? Because if they hadn't discussed these boundaries, they haven't clarified, I don't want porn. I don't want you to go porn because it makes me feel X, right? Like I perceive this as a boundary of you're violating my boundary.
We can't know what those violations are until our partner tells us this is a boundary.
Yeah.
So it's, and I hesitate saying this because I know some people cringe, but it's on both partners to prevent infidelity.
It is. Yeah.
By sharing those boundaries, by saying, this is my line. This is what I will accept and why I won't.
Yeah. And going back to this idea, I think with couples, a lot of times they just want to know why. That's such a complex question because it could be various reasons. There's a lot of reasons for divorce. The most typical is unmet needs in a relationship. Really, unmet needs and feeling unloved. And there are some trends, right? So men, it tends to be, they perceive infidelity when something physical happens. And for women, if they perceive something emotional happens. And that in heterosexual relationships, that causes some issues because their definitions are different. So they don't think they cheated if they didn't do one or the other. Right?
I've encountered that with couples of, well, I didn't have sex with her. So it's not infidelity. It's not cheating.
Yeah.
I just flirted with her. I just kissed her or whatever, but I didn't have sex. So therefore, I mean, I shouldn't have done it maybe, but it's not infidelity.
Yeah. And the questions I get, so the men typically, well, did you have sex with them? I want to know. And then, for the female partner, typically, well, did you love
her?
Yeah. Did you love them? Her? Yeah. Whoever.
Did you find her more attractive than me?
Yeah. A lot more of this emotional connection, right? But it does, like on a general level in relationships, it tends to be this unmet need, which is responsible for both partners. Now it's not to blame because that was a choice of that partner to go out, but typically it's not feeling good, or for men insecure and for women unloved and invalidated.
With the unmet needs, it's not just unmet sexual needs. I think that's an important point. It can be unmet emotional connection. It can be feeling like our home life is stressful, which we all feel like our home life is stressful at some point, but we cope in different ways. And this can be one way someone chooses to cope.
Yeah. And for men, it typically, like there is with sex, right? It doesn't always have to be sex, but typically it's this idea of, well, I'm not getting sex. And the attention, like say a baby comes along on the baby and can be perceived as insecure, right? If their self-worth is in that kind of interaction in the relationship, which, hopefully there's more to this relationship and feeling love than kind of just the sex. But that's just what I hear quite often is, well, the sex stopped, so they don't love me. I'm not good enough. I must be ugly, right? And then if they're aging, my body's not the same.
Or mom, I've had moms who are postpartum and going through it of, he doesn't like my postpartum body.
Right.
I'm not in shape enough, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And this kind of leads into individual reasons. So infidelity can happen for a lot of reasons, right? Both on the relationship stuff, unmet needs, but also on the individual level, which influences a couple relationships. So for example, attachment, right? Maybe somebody has an insecure attachment. So maybe they grew up with this fear of always being left because they didn't have a caregiver that was consistent, right? So now as an adult, they perceive this continual relationship dynamic as they might be left. Right. So this might lead to that, to kind of make up for this, like I am worthy.
Building off of that, when we have an insecure, and it's worth noting, so a secure attachment is you can go far, but I know you're going to come back. I can trust that you're going to care for me. I can trust that I can explore my environment and come back to as a safe base. Insecure, I don't know if you're going to be there. And in some cases, I don't know if I want you there, but I also don't not want you there. So it creates this complicated dynamic. But I think about with the insecure attachment, sometimes we also self-sabotage. If the relationship is going well, or if, okay, there's a little speed bump, oh, the whole thing must be screwed. So therefore, I do the most egregious act for some couples.
Yeah.
Just so that I can control when this relationship is going to end or how it's going to end.
Or maybe to bring up a topic of conversation that won't be addressed until something severe happens, right? Yeah.
And so we self-sabotage. And this doesn't just happen in infidelity, right? People self-sabotage all the time through insecurity, through doubt, through kind of quitting or giving up on ourselves. But infidelity is one shining example of how that can come through.
Yeah. I want to go back to what you're talking about in terms of attachment. You talked about that safe place, but I want to use the term safe haven because that's actually the name of your private practice. And I love that term because it really encompasses attachment. Is this person a safe haven? And maybe they are, but again, if maybe in family of origin stuff, you grew up with this attachment where how you conceptualize an interaction on an emotional level of how do I connect with them, right? How do I feel vulnerable with them? And it might not be in a healthy way. And so now in adult relationships, you're not necessarily connecting emotionally, right? And so now the unmet needs are there.
Yep. And even for growing up insecure, right? Yeah. And I love my caregiver, but they're abusive, or I love my caregiver, but they're not consistent. I get this message that for love to be present, it has to be this push-pull, almost like underlining tension or toxicity. And so when we are in partnership then with someone who is secure, it can feel actually really uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable. Yep.
We think that just because something's healthy, it's going to feel good. And it doesn't right away.
Yeah.
Because it's not familiar, because it feels strange. It feels maybe phony.
Yeah.
And thus we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not the homeostasis, right? Not the norm that they grew up with. We talked about that in a previous episode too, where they on an unconscious level tend to be drawn more towards something that's similar to what they grew up in. And that may not be healthy, right? Other reasons too, I think on an individual level is mental illness, right? I think about, I've had clients with a diagnosis of bipolar, right? And they've had manic episodes. And in the manic episode, this typically where it occurs, right? Some of them, like they'll go on a huge shopping spree and buy a car. Other ones, it's the sex. And so you'll see that too in that case.
It can show up with narcissistic personality disorder.
Oh, yes.
Even depression or anxiety as a way of having some joy or euphoria or reconnecting with our pleasure centers of our brain.
Yeah. I want to go back to narcissistic personality disorder because there's a couple of factors in there that really, it makes sense, right? First of all, you have this sense of entitlement.
Yep.
Right. I deserve this.
Egocentric, right? The world revolves around me and thus I must be pleased first.
And the other thing is typically with narcissism, this lack of empathy. So now you don't feel guilty for doing it. So there's really nothing there to really inhibit that kind of opportunity if it arises, right?
And empathy is the ability, when we talk about empathy, it's not just the ability to see that you're hurting, it's our ability to almost feel what you're feeling and to join in that experience. And that trait, empathy, doesn't really align with narcissistic personality disorder.
No. Yeah. So that makes sense in that context, right? Now, granted, if you're listening to this and your partner's cheated, no, don't go down the rabbit hole and think they must be narcissistic. There's a lot of reasons. Substance use is one, right? Especially with alcohol, because now we're kind of reducing our ability to inhibit our responses or desires, right?
We lose our prefrontal cortex. So we lose our rational and planful thinking.
Yeah. That self-control piece. So that could happen. And if you think about this, a lot of people go out, they drink, right? So here you going out there, maybe you have unmet needs in the relationship. So it's already lingering there. And then now you're drinking alcohol and
we're flirting, we're feeling joy, that pleasure.
Yeah. That we haven't felt in this long-term relationship in a while, right? Trying to think of any other individual things that we might see that have come up.
Even like family of origin, back to that piece of what we know through a lot of research is that if your parents participated in infidelity in their marriage or
and
even other loved
ones,
to it.
If you're exposed to it.
If you're exposed to it, you're more likely yourself.
Yeah.
Or if you had infidelity in a previous relationship, you're more likely to repeat.
Yeah.
Like we hear that phrase of once a cheater, always a cheater. And there are, of course, caveats to everything.
Yeah.
And there's a ring of truth in that.
Some of the research supports that for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, there's so many complex reasons why
absolutely
somebody could cheat. And that's sometimes hard to really get down to. And when I work with couples, it's really getting to a shared meaning, right? Whatever the reason, can we get to a shared meaning, right?
Meaning of the event, not the why, which is so hard because what couples want is, why did you do this to me?
The details too.
What did I do wrong? Yeah. And when that partner can't give that answer, because the details they can, unless they were inebriated, can often give the details, which we'll talk in a minute whether or not that's beneficial. But the why, often it's not this like conscious, rational, planful thing.
No.
And so we look back and say, I don't know why I did it. I don't know why. And that can be really infuriating for one or both partners but I need to know the why.
Yeah.
And there may not be an answer. So how do we reconcile that, right?
Yeah. And if they knew the why, that probably wouldn't have led to this, right? Say the why was, I'm not feeling my needs met. Well, if you knew that, then you would probably hopefully address that in the relationship before it got to that point. But a lot of times people don't know that. They don't know what's going on. They just don't feel that connection anymore.
It's a symptom of a greater problem.
Typically, yeah. Yeah. And then going with the details, right? I get clients who really want to know the details. I tend to verge away from this or steer away from a lot of details, because one of the symptoms that come up consistently is the person who was cheated on. They have a lot of intrusive thoughts. And this
maybe describe what that is really quick.
So intrusive thoughts are kind of this idea of, all right, so the cheating happened. Maybe we've agreed to continue and try to work through this. Well, now my mind is wondering, well, are they at work? Are they texting that person right now?
Consumes them, right? These thoughts are coming in without an ability to kind of stop.
It is so tough. And the details really fuel this. And they really don't get us anywhere, right? Because we want to get on the process of how it got to this point, not necessarily what happened, right? Because it can, again, we talked earlier, it's very subjective. What does that look like? And a bit different for different people. So I tend to steer away from that. And that's typically kind of what the literature talks about, is not getting that. But there are some couples who really need to know. I had a couple that was her condition for moving on, is I need to know the details, and he wasn't willing to give that. So ended up not working out.
I would think, like, I think to myself of, if I were in that position, I probably would be the detail person, right? Because that is how I operate in everyday life. And so research does suggest that we go to more of this meaning making, and there are nuances in treatment, right?
Yeah.
Nuances in how we go through it and what details are actually important and which would just be painful or harmful.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, as we know more details, we have more questions. We have more of, well, shit, I'm not good enough, or I'm whatever.
Yeah.
So it's having, and I can't stress this enough, if you are experiencing an infidelity, or you have a loved one who is, and they're wanting to get support, go to someone who knows what they're doing on how to treat this. Because if a therapist is untrained in this realm, it can be so painful and make things
very much
incredibly worse.
Yeah. You want to find a good fit, and a fit with somebody who has worked with this before, because it's tough. It's really about balance, right? It's a really good job. It's doing a good job of making sure we're not blaming, but also understanding who's holding the responsibility right now, while in a very nice way, try to figure out at a relationship level, how can we improve this dynamic so these needs can be met, right?
And what you just pointed out, the relationship piece, this might make some people cringe, but when we talk about infidelity, yes, there is someone who is centrally responsible for committing that act. But when we actually spend time processing how we got there, where we go from here, both partners have a role. It's not just on the cheater to fix this.
That decision is.
Yes.
But the process that led to that potential symptom.
And so we have to work as a team.
Yeah. Unless it's like purely on the individual level, but it's really hard to look at those individual reasons we just talk about and think that they don't influence the relationship.
I'd say that's very rare, that it's solely that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to that treatment piece of details versus not. Really getting curious about, what purpose would these details serve me? If I knew that it happened in my bed, would that actually serve me?
Yeah.
If I knew her name, what she looked like, whatever it is, the details of what happened, really getting clear of, how would that serve me? Is it just curiosity?
Yeah.
Or is it something that I actually need in my healing? And by and large, people don't need those.
Yeah. They convince themselves they do.
Absolutely.
I can't tell you how many times I've asked, like, how would that help you? Oh, I just need to know. Why? I need to. I won't be able to move on if I don't. It's like, there's just this need, right? It's so strong. And I mean, there's a couple things that I look for to see if it's going to be successful. One is commitment. Are you committed to this relationship again? Can you be committed to this relationship again?
Committed to finding forgiveness.
And working through, because couples who work through this can be way better off than they were before this infidelity happened. And the reason why is because you're literally laid bare. You're addressing things on a very vulnerable, deep level that typically aren't addressed unless you deal with something like this. So that commitment to work through this. And the other one is the capacity for forgiveness for the person who was cheated on. Can you forgive? Or is it going to be holding over their head and conditional response? Well, you need to do this because, you know, you're the one who caused all this problems, right? A lot of that stuff, like, the frustration makes sense. You're allowed to feel frustrated, but long-term, that's not going to help. And actually, it's going to drive the person further.
I ask couples that question of, do you have that ability to forgive? And often they'll say, well, I don't know how to. And I explain, like, the how to is my role, right? As a therapist, I'll get you to the how to. But do you have the desire to forgive?
That's the key.
Do you have the desire to move forward? Because if the desire is just to punish or pin it against someone for life, we won't move forward. We won't make progress.
Yeah. And I do think it's okay to work with a therapist, or, I mean, hopefully, and work towards a shared meaning of why it happened, and then decide maybe this isn't for me. And that's okay too.
Such a good point.
Right. But a commitment to try to work together to process this is what I'm looking for. And then to work through it. Right. And that decision at the end may not be, and maybe they won't be able to forgive, but that's also helpful too. Right.
In either case, whether you stay together or not, processing through can help reduce that trauma response that is potentially there. It can reduce the risk of us bringing this baggage to the next relationship. So whether we want to stay together or not, I always encourage people, get support, work through it.
And one thing I want to note in the context of attachment, right? We talked about it as an individual reason why this might happen, but you've also may have grown up in a very healthy home, a very secure attachment, but maybe you've been cheated on, and that you're right would lead to kind of some insecure attachment that you'd bring potentially to the next relationship if not resolved. So it can be kind of this learned attachment through experience, right? Because we're a little bit further removed from our childhood when we're adults, right? We still have that kind of, I think, template, but we definitely can establish new forms of attachment in relationships, especially if we're dealing with a lot of traumatic experiences like infidelity.
Okay, so I have a hard question for you, Greg, because I know this is like your specialty is infidelity. So what if you have two partners come in and one partner wants to call it infidelity and one partner doesn't? If the even like verbiage around it is different, what do you do?
I mean, my curiosity goes to, well, how do you conceptualize it? And were these ideas, again, boundaries from the get-go discussed about what this looks like or not? And another thing that comes to my mind, just kind of as you put me on the spot here, is the idea of, is that person who's denying that just defensive because of their fear of what happens when they admit it? So if you're to admit this, does it feel safe enough to admit this, or do you feel like you're gonna be punished? Because the person who cheated, right, we come in and there's just a lot of shame and guilt. There is, you can see it, even if they're defensive, there's a lot of shame and guilt, unless we're dealing with some maybe narcissistic personality disorder. But what is the partner who was cheated on doing? Are they punishing them? Are they berating them, criticizing them? How are they letting out that frustration, anger, which they're allowed to experience? But how is that coming out and affecting the relationship? And because of that, does that facilitate any safetiness for this person to say, let's work through this. I feel safe with you to admit my wrongs. So those are some things that I come to my mind.
What if they genuinely don't believe it? Like say someone comes in and they say like, I just kissed her. I just flirted with her, but I didn't have sex with her. I just had foreplay, but I didn't have sex. So therefore it's not cheating.
It's going to come down if that other partner really wants to move forward with this. If they can't get past this, can they stay in this relationship or want to stay in this relationship knowing that that person's not willing to admit it? I've actually had this multiple times happen where they're not willing to admit that, like, I didn't. And typically with some time working, we get to that point, but I've noticed it's when we start building this safety. Right. Because when couples come in, they're very tumultuous often, not always. I've had some calm couples, but a lot of fighting, a lot of chaos. Right. And so we work on things to create this safer timeouts. How do we navigate this conflict? How do we not use you language? Things like that to make it safe. And once you make it safe and get to a point where they feel like they can maybe express this stuff on a deeper level, we might get to that. But if not, like, again, I've had a couple that they just weren't willing to budge on their kind of expectations. And if one of those is, no, I don't define it this way, and the other person expects them to define it the way that they do, then, it's a good question. Do you want to continue with this? What about for you?
Ooh, flipping it back on me. I see what you did there.
Yeah. I mean, therapists have different styles, right?
They do. They do. One thing I always tell couples, whether it's infidelity or not, my role as a therapist isn't to save your marriage or relationship.
Yep.
Nor can I. I'm not magically gifted in that way, or I'd probably be a billionaire, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
But my job is to help both partners come to a healthy solution for themselves. And sometimes that's continuation of the relationship. Sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
So I always lay that out.
Yep.
I also have them both, and you kind of talked about this, but both define, what does infidelity look like for you? Can we lean into our partner's definition, especially a cheater leaning into their partner's definition? Can I lean into it? Can I say, like, I don't agree, and I can see why you might feel that way?
Yeah.
Validation can come without agreement, and validation can go really far in that space.
Yeah. And oftentimes I think the important piece, what you just talked about in regards to the definitions, is we're agreeing to live by our partner's definition of that. When we get
such a good point. Not by our own.
No.
But by the others.
However, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is you have a partner who is monogamous and the other one who identifies as poly.
I've worked with a few couples. So I have worked with couples who are in thruples, so 3 partners.
Yep.
I've worked with poly couples, swingers, polymonos, all kinds of constellations of relationships. And the defining feature across the board, whatever you want to call it, even in monogamy, where both partners are monogamous, is setting boundaries.
Yeah.
Is setting limits or rules around, okay, if my partner is poly and I'm mono, I am agreeing to them being poly, but under what condition? What are there places that are off limits? Are there times or seasons that are off limits? Are there sexual acts or emotional limits, which is its own ball of wax because emotions aren't conscious, right? But in any case, it's talking about it before we engage in it.
Yeah.
And creating an agreed definition of what this looks like, agreed set of rules, and agreed meaning.
Because in those dynamics, there's a lot more risk for boundary violation if those aren't talked about, right? Because we're talking about different perspectives of how relationships function coming together, right?
Even with thruples, where all 3 partners engage with one another, figuring out, how do we balance my time with partner A and partner B, and how do partner A and partner B balance their time without me?
Yep, absolutely.
How do we interact with each other so everyone feels balanced? I think of it like a dance. It is a very tricky dance that for some couples feels more authentic, which I'm in full support of whatever feels authentic and healthy for those partners. But it's being really careful and cognizant of, how do we do this and do this well so that both of us can feel safe?
Yeah.
And that's the bottom of any of this, right? It's feeling safe and knowing our boundaries with one another.
Yeah, we've said boundaries multiple times, right? Because that's a huge thing. Because essentially, when we look at infidelity, it's a boundary violation. And those boundaries are what's subjective and also what our responsibility to put into place. So
what gets really hard too with polymono couples or poly or thruples is because it isn't the traditional relationship, we don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I'll see couples or thruples going through this and trying to navigate, but not having the words or tools to do that because they're too ashamed to tell their loved ones. They have to keep it secret. They don't have a guide on how to do this well. So then they try to get through it. And by way of trying to get through it, someone makes a mistake.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so if this is something you or your partner or someone you know is thinking about, I always encourage getting support first.
Yeah. Because
it's a lot easier to get support on the front end to prep and do it well than to have to come in after there's a violation.
Yeah. And it's not abnormal, right? This happens, you know, frequently. I mean, there's statistics ranging from 20% up to over 40%, but it's clear that those in marriages, the statistics are a little less than those in kind of, you know, not being or unmarried. So it's not something that's rare and you're alone in this. This happens.
It's not as uncommon as people might think. Some people, monogamy is a default, right? Like it is
Yeah.
For me, like I feel safest in a monogamous relationship.
Mm-hmm.
For other people, monogamy isn't authentic. It doesn't align with who they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thus the idea of staying in just monogamy can be painful. It can be a value violation where I don't feel like I can be my whole self.
Yeah. I'm thinking of some other reasons couples might get into. Another one is abuse.
Ooh, say more about that.
Well, if there's kind of abuse and I'll just say verbal abuse, right? Where you're continually being beat down verbally in terms of not good enough.
Yeah.
Right. That leads to that low self-esteem, which is also an individual predictor. But if it's also exacerbated in the context of a relationship through criticism or things like that, maybe that low self-esteem drives to go prove that you're worthy. Right. So we see it in that context. We talked about the unmet needs.
So where do couples go from here? Once the infidelity breaks, and that day is often the hardest day a couple will face, is that realization of, oh, my partner was not fidelitous to me.
Yeah.
Where do couples go from there?
I mean, I think the biggest or the first step is to really just, is this something I want to work through? Right. Try to take a step back from all the, there's going to be a lot of emotions, a lot of hurt, a lot of
complex
pain,
emotions, anger, sadness, fear, grief.
Right. And it might be the grief of the anticipatory loss or potentially ambiguous loss.
Or grief of what I thought was.
Yeah. The anticipatory. Yeah. And so there's a lot of that, but taking a step back and be like, is this something I want to work through? And maybe you don't know that, and go to somebody who's trained in working through this to maybe even use therapy as a way to discern that. Because not everybody knows, right? And this is going through and being like, okay, let's get to a safe place so we can talk about it and process it and then decide if there's something we want to continue.
And sometimes it doesn't start with couples therapy. Sometimes it starts with individual.
Yeah.
So that we can get some coping skills on board, some self-soothing skills on board, so we can have those harder conversations.
And I think another important thing is depersonalize it. Don't blame yourself.
So hard to do.
Don't blame yourself. Do not blame yourself.
It isn't yours to hold. And I tell couples that, and it is just like, that's a hard truth to take in, to integrate.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we've talked earlier about both partners play a role, but not to the extent, don't blame yourself, right? For that decision that was made.
So getting therapy. If I also talk about like friends, right? So friends find out your partner was a cheater.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. For any friends of people who are going through infidelity, phrases that are not helpful include just leave him or her.
Yeah.
They're such a piece of shit.
Such a good point. Yeah.
Well, what were you doing wrong? These are all non-helpful phrases.
Yeah.
And again, that's our reactive state. We're angry for our friend or our loved one, but it's not helpful, because if they do choose to reconcile, if they do choose to move through this, and now they know you feel some type of way about the partner, that's a whole nother animal that they've got to face. So instead, as a friend, just listening, man, that sounds incredibly tough. How can I support you? Even things like, can I come give you a hug? Do you want to get away with me for a weekend as a friend?
Yeah.
Encouraging them to seek counsel or pray or whatever it is that's authentic for them.
Yeah.
But really going towards that empathy and validation rather than more judgment, more criticism. Yeah. Not helpful.
Yeah. And I love that you brought that up, because it's such a good point in the context of working with couples who want to continue, is going back and be like, who have you talked to, and who is still being talked to about your pain and your suffering? So it could be your parents, which are the in-laws. So if you continue, now there's that long-term relationship with them so really, I think being conscientious of here we go again, boundaries and who you're willing to share with, which in the moment is so hard, because you're just panicking
and you want support.
And
support's not bad. Let's be clear. It's not bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't know what to do. So you go to your safe haven, right?
Ooh, it's a tough one, because the people we lean on are also the people we'd have to go back and be like, just kidding.
And they're going to want to support you, right? Right. They're going to want, this is my friend, this is my baby, like my child. But ultimately, if you choose to go forward, you need the support of the relationship from the other people, not just you as the partner.
And I think if you go into therapy with your partner, again, recognizing that the choice was theirs, absolutely their choice.
Yeah.
But the role of repair is on both partners.
Yeah.
And that can be hard for some partners or couples to reconcile that I didn't do this. So why do I have to do any work? And it's this hard, again, dance.
It is.
But as you're going in, trying to stay even just a little bit open to how can I help improve this situation? How can I help move us towards healing? How can I work towards my own forgiveness?
How can we reshape the dynamics that once were that potentially could have led to this, right? That led to the unmet needs. And really kind of beef that up and improve our ability to connect and understand what that looks like, right? Because if one of the top predictors in the couple from the couple side is the unmet needs, how do we meet each other's needs? And I can't tell you how many couples that I've met with that don't know each other's love language, which love language is very cliche. It's out there, buzzword, but ultimately I think it's such a good step of just a starting point of saying like, oh, this is how I feel validated.
And they can move and ebb and flow. So I encourage people to 100%. Do this every year.
Yeah.
Right.
But knowing, because our partners are not mind readers, we need to help each other understand what each other need. And that's one thing, right? I'll digress, but we'll come back on track, but is the idea of my partner should know.
Mind reader.
Yeah. And it's not, no, this is where our role comes in. Our responsibility, what you're talking about is it's our responsibility to advocate this and set that roadmap and not set them up for failure.
They should have known not to do that.
Yeah.
They should have known that would have bothered me.
Yeah.
And I asked partners, did you tell them that?
Yeah, not the cheating, just others. Yeah, okay.
But even like texting an ex-girlfriend or something.
Yeah.
He should have known not to text her. Have you talked about that? And boundaries, again, going back to those boundaries, but they do look different by relationship. So just because your boundaries were one way in a different partnership or within your home doesn't mean the same are coming here.
Yeah.
Right. Like my husband and I, if we're out and about and he sees an attractive woman, he's probably going to tell me like, "Ooh, she's cute." Doesn't bother me an inch.
Yeah.
For other couples, that would be a violation.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, it goes back to the differences, right? There's couples where one of them wants their partner to watch porn because they can't meet their needs all the time, right? They don't have that fear. But for other couples, they're in because their partner's watching porn, and that was a violation. So, anything else? Any like last minute tips or thoughts you might have?
Just know that like you don't have to be alone in this process.
No.
Infidelity next to death is probably one of the hardest things a couple might face and go through.
Yeah.
But you don't have to walk it alone by any means. And so finding that good support person, if you need referrals, reach out to us, right? Through that email. And Greg and I will happily send you referrals within the state of Colorado. And then mine's Wyoming, Colorado and Wyoming for myself. But don't be shy.
Yeah.
If you need support, we all have our speed bumps or our demons within our relationship. They just may look different.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. So, well, always, we appreciate you listening and tuning into Relationships Inside Out, where we dissect relationships and talk to them ad nauseum. But if you have any questions or comments, concerns, even just feedback, please email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com or put a post.
Thank you.